I'm very happy to have on this episode Steve Adubato. Steve is a broadcaster and author. He is a motivational speaker. He has his doctorate from Rutgers University. And here in the North Jersey, New York City media market, many people would know Steve from hosting a number of major public affairs television programs. He's written a new book called Lessons in Leadership and ties together the ideas of being a great communicator and a great leader. Now, Steve, I could always just say to you, I've been a broadcaster and a professor for over 30 years. I've been competing in public speaking since high school. I know this stuff. What would be your answer to me if I gave you an arrogant response like that in terms of communicating as a leader?
Well, first of all, Bob, it's a pleasure and an honor to speak with you, and I'm a fan of the show, and I listen all the time and learn all the time. And the first thing I would tell you is that when someone tells you, and I know you actually would not say this in real life, I've got this down, I'm the best, I've perfected communication, I am the best leader, and there's nothing left to learn, run away from that person as quickly as possible because you know that person is delusional. Because the one thing I've learned about leadership and about communication is that there's no such thing as perfection, and that the people who are really good at this are obsessed with learning something new, obsessed with trying to figure out how to get better. So Michael Jordan, back in the day, if you will, did not have the greatest jump shot, may not have been the best from the foul line. So what made him the best? Staying at practice when everyone else left and shooting again and again from the three-point line and from the foul line. And so LeBron James does that today, and all the greats continue to try to get better at where they might not be at their best. And sports is no different from communication or leadership. And so when people say, I've got it, this is where I want to be, the status quo is good enough, that's when you know you don't have a great leader or a great communicator.
Thank you for understanding that I was only playing a role and kidding about that, because there are people out there who would say, hey, I already am the best. Now, some could say, and I'm not asking you to be political, that could be Donald Trump, but let's play both parties as we go into the heart of the 2016 election with the two main candidates clearly chosen and going one-on-one. What are some of the communication leadership mistakes being made by both Trump and Clinton?
You know, they're similar, Bob, and they're different. Excuse me, in this sense. I would argue that Trump is a better platform speaker, a more charismatic speaker, someone who can play to the crowd more effectively than Hillary Clinton, who can be a bit stiff. And again, you teach this, you live it every day. But that has nothing to do with leadership in this sense. My problem with Donald Trump is that I would argue he is not fit to lead. Not only not fit to lead the country, and this is not political at all because I'm no fan of Hillary Clinton when it comes to leadership, and we'll talk about that in a second. Donald Trump's biggest failure as a leadership from a leadership perspective is this. Every time he makes an obvious mistake, every time he does something that is so clearly egregious, his first instinct is not to apologize, not to own it, not to be responsible, not to say, hey, that's on me. His first instinct, Bob, is to attack. His first instinct is to call names. His first instinct is to get into the gutter and be petty. That is not what a great leader does. A great leader owns it. A great leader says, listen, what I said when I made fun of someone who was a New York Times reporter who had a disability, that was absurd. That was beneath me or anybody else running for the presidency, and I'm embarrassed for what I did. Instead, he lies. I was not making fun of him. You misinterpret it. Every time it happens, he sees acknowledging a mistake or something egregious that he does as a weakness. I see his weakness as his inability to acknowledge that he's terribly flawed like the rest of us.
So how about Hillary? It seems that she also has the inability to apologize.
Something they have in common. You know, I will tell you that even for those who think they agree with Hillary Clinton on the politics of how she views the world, or they think they agree with her on health care or they're pro-choice or whatever it is. And I try not to look at this from a political point of view. I try to look at it from a communication and leadership perspective as much as possible. I will tell you this about Hillary Clinton. I am embarrassed by the way she handled this email situation because She continually said, again and again, I turned everything over. I did nothing wrong. I only did what Colin Powell did when he was Secretary of State. I'm no worse than anyone else. She basically lowered the bar for herself, on herself, to the point where she owned nothing. She and Trump are very much the same in that way. And until the FBI director came out and said, no, we're not going to indict her, but in fact, she did not turn everything over. She did withhold lots of information. There is a lot of information that was exposed in a private email server that, in fact, other countries who would do evil things to us could have easily gotten access to. She admitted nothing. And afterwards, she comes out, not only doesn't acknowledge how embarrassing it was, she acts like she was exonerated. And the problem I have with Mrs. Clinton is this. She, too, sees acknowledging weakness. She, too, sees acknowledging a mistake as a weakness. And I don't know how Clinton and Trump wind up being very similar in that way, but I will tell you, from my experience as a leader, teaching it, coaching it, and living it every day, the truly great leaders acknowledge their weakness, acknowledge it as an opportunity to improve, and also use it as a teaching tool for everyone around them and create a culture that says, look, the only way to get better is to acknowledge where we've made mistakes, put it on the table, and grow. These two are so far away from that, Bob.
I'm going to get some free Steve Adubato advice. I am living, as do you, in a lot of different worlds. I mean, you work as a broadcaster and as an author, as I mentioned, and of course you teach and do many things. And here at Caldwell University, where this program is produced, I am the president of the Faculty Council, which in some other universities is called the Faculty Senate. I got called on the carpet not long ago, a couple of months ago, the end of the semester, by a number of people who said that in a meeting with my colleagues that I was defensive. Now, I don't have video on this, but when I think about it, I probably was. It was more than just explaining my position. I was told that I had gotten defensive. How do you avoid getting defensive when you are being criticized, when you are being questioned in a very tough fashion? How do you avoid overreacting?
It is a great question, and it's a great opportunity for your audience to really sit back and think about what I'm about to say. I will tell you that the most natural thing we do is to protect and defend ourselves. You know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Forget about self-actualization or recognition. Food and shelter and protection. We protect ourselves. We defend ourselves. We defend our families. So here's what happens. Someone says something about us that we think hurts us. Our natural instinct, in many ways, is to either lash out, defend, or say, you don't understand. And here's the problem with it. I've come to understand, and by the way, Bob, I am guilty of the same thing. And in my book, Lessons in Leadership, I want to make it crystal clear that one of the first chapters and the hardest one for me to write was the following. You cannot lead others until you learn to lead yourself. And in that chapter, you just talked about one area where you were defensive. I must cite 10 examples where I got it wrong and was terribly defensive. So here's my point. You never win as a leader when you just explain why someone doesn't understand what you just did and why you're right and they're wrong. We can go on and say, no, I'm not being defensive, and you don't understand me, and here's why I did what I did. And very rarely will you get the other person saying, oh, my gosh, Bob, now that you explained it, I take back everything I said. I must have been wrong. You're right. I'm wrong.
But I wanted it to work out that way, Steve.
Yeah, right? Isn't that funny how it plays out that way? Ultimately, here's what I've come to understand. Feedback is a funny thing. I often tell my clients, I do a lot of one-on-one executive coaching. I tell my students the same thing. And by the way, when I've gotten feedback as a professor, I want every student to say, oh, my God, Dr. Adubato, you're terrific. But when I look at it, I'm sitting there saying, Adubato, you teach people to accept feedback. This student thought that you were pontificating. This student thought that you were too aggressive or pushy. You better shut up and take your own advice right now. Here's what I'm trying to get at. When you get feedback from someone, you can't argue, and here's why. That's how they saw it. And, Bob, here's the dilemma. What are you going to tell someone? That's not what they saw? You're actually telling someone that what they think they perceived, you being defensive or you being whatever, is not accurate. You're saying you didn't see yourself that way, but they saw you that way. And it's often referred to as Dr. Richard Carlson, who wrote Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. He used to call it separate realities. Their reality is different than yours. And the really great leaders do the following. The ones who are disciplined and have, emotional intelligence, et cetera, they step back and they say, you know what? I may not understand exactly what they're saying or why they're saying it, but I can't lose by taking a step back and understanding that that's how they saw it, and I can only grow from it because that's their feedback. And if I take it and they believe that I'm listening to them, I may have a chance of winning them over. You never win these arguments, Bob, by telling them, you just don't understand me. We never win.
But isn't it possible, Steve, that you could look weak or vacillating or like a capitulator?
If every single time you take a position and someone takes another position and you turn around and say, oh, my gosh, I'm going to be with you because I guess I'm wrong and I'm an idiot, and you know what, forget about what I said. Yes, of course, everything in moderation. But here's the thing. I'm going to argue that, especially in the New York, New Jersey area where we're from, I'm going to argue, I know the show is listened to across the country, I'm going to say that in certain parts of the country, we're overly aggressive. We're overly assertive to the point where we think the only point of view is our point of view. And I know I'm generalizing. However, I'm going to say that most of us need to take a step back and try to understand where another person is coming from, even if we don't agree with them. And I'm saying to you, Bob, you don't necessarily have to agree with what the other person is saying. You have to accept their, quote, separate reality as they see it and say, you know what, even if I don't understand where you're coming from, my job is to try to step back and say, I respect your point of view. I'm going to try to understand it. I often say to people, ask a question instead of make a statement. Instead of saying, you're wrong and I'm right, I would turn around if someone said, I don't often do this, but when I do it, the game is played better. When I say the game of relationships. Someone says, I think you're being defensive. When you're on your game, here's what you do. Well, I'm not sure. Bob, help me understand something. Tell me exactly what I'm doing that causes you to say I'm acting defensive. Well, when you do X, Y, Z, you're coming across as defensive. All of a sudden, that person's definition of being defensive may be different than yours, Bob. And you realize that how they define it and how you define it is different. Therefore, how could they be wrong?
That's very good advice. And of course, as you're up there and the emotions are going and your heart is beating and you feel that this person's position is going to keep you from getting where you need to get, a lot of these other things come into play. So you have to have these things in your mind and really discipline them, as you say. Be a lifelong learner, continue to try to develop yourself and grow. Even if you think you're good or you're experienced, there's always going to be something where you hit a wall because of the fact that you weren't ready for it. I guess that's all part of it.
Hey, Bob, interesting how you just said that. You're in the moment. You're in it. It's happening. And in this chapter that I talked about, you can't lead others until you lead yourself. One of the things I cop to, and I'll say it right here to your national audience on Sirius, is this. I grew up in a family, in a very, let's say a very loud, assertive, and aggressive Italian-American family in New Jersey, and I'll translate that. Everyone thought they were right in our family. About anything they ever said, they were right, everybody else was wrong. So
you even had to yell when you said that, Steve.
See what I mean? So I grew up in a family where no one ever said over the dinner table, that's interesting, to my sisters, Teresa and Michelle. Oh, tell me a little bit more about your point of view. I never thought about that perspective. It was like I was going to explain to them why I was right and they were wrong. And here's what I'm trying to get at. The more we learn to slow down, the more we learn to have muscle memory kick in. What I mean by that is we're so quick to argue that if we start slowing down and saying, you know what, the first thing I'm going to do is ask a question, you would be surprised at how we can retrain ourselves as leaders. Because I'm going to tell you, one thing I learned in my family, the other thing was blaming. I grew up with a very aggressive dad. When things went wrong, who screwed up? I'm going to nail the person who screwed up, and they're going to pay the price. And I learned that leadership style. And in writing this book, Bob, I learned that one of the first things that I do when things go wrong in my organization is blame. And when you blame and you point that finger, everyone shuts down. And in the book, I talk about how I have learned. I'm continuing to try to learn to slow down when things go wrong. And instead of asking who did it, the muscle memory that I'm trying to pick up now is what went wrong, why did it go wrong, and what do we need to do to fix it? So instead of being more blame-oriented, I'm trying to get better at being more solution-oriented. The reason I'm sharing that is because lifelong learning means constantly looking, and I'm repeating myself, where and how you need to get better. And the fact that you write 5 books on leadership and communication doesn't mean you have it right. And the people who run around saying, I'm the leadership or communication guru, again, run away from those people.
You're listening to Let's Consider the Source. I'm Bob Mann. This is the weekly media issues program on SiriusXM Insight. We're in our 10th season right here, right now on the Insight channel, where we're very happy to be on channel 121. Saturdays at 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific. Sundays 11 a.m. in the East, 8 a.m. in the West. And we discuss the nation's most important and interesting media issues. We come from the Department of Communication and Media Studies at Caldwell University in New Jersey. And I urge you to find out more about our very practical department by going to Caldwell, CALDWELL.edu. And also, please follow me on Twitter. My handle, Bob Mann Media, BOBMANN Media. My guest, Steve Adubato, who is here in the New York, New Jersey area, very well known as the host of a number of very prominent and award-winning public affairs television programs. He's an author. He has a doctorate from Rutgers University, and he has written a book which is going to be out very soon. We're going to find out some of those details in a second. Lessons in Leadership, really talking about the blend and the philosophy and the mix of leadership and communication. Before we get into some of the specifics, Steve, on how to pick up the book, let's talk a little bit about data dumpers. I've been, and you've been, to so many conferences where people will just give you the stats, and stats are important, but they'll give them to you ad nauseum until the eyes glaze over. Does data dumping, it's something where you want some credibility, but can it be avoided?
It has to be avoided. We have no choice if we're really going to connect with people and have them understand what we're trying to say and why we're saying it, to take the 50-page, 70-page PowerPoint presentation that dumps data on people and get rid of it immediately. I had a client just a couple of hours ago, Bob, say to me, hey, listen, as at a major corporation, I'm not going to say the name because I don't want to lose that client. So,
good move.
Right? The client, my mother didn't raise a fool. So my client says to me, listen, I have a big presentation coming up. I have about 10 minutes. I have 40 slides, but I'm going to put the slides up, but I'm not going to speak to the slides. And so I said, well, why do you have the 40 slides? And so she said to me, well, I have the 40 slides because that's what we do in our company. I said, well, why do you have the 40 slides and that's what you do at the company if you're not going to use the slides? It's just what we do. Does anyone look at the slides? No. Well, why do you have them? And you go in a circle. So here's what I've concluded. That the standard practice of dumping data and showing charts and graphs and statistics with numbers you can't even see, but just trying to demonstrate or prove on some illogical level that we've done so much work, like prove your work in some sort of math exam. We confuse that with communicating and connecting in a 10-minute presentation that says, look, here's the problem, here's what we need to do, here's what happens if we don't turn this around in the next period of time, and here's what happens if we do what I'm proposing. Let's get about this business, and here's what I recommend that we do over the next 20 or 30 days. We need to be more persuasive in our presentations. We need to be more engaging in our presentations. We all went to college. We went to graduate school, you know, you and I, advanced degrees, the whole bit. How many times are we sitting there and then we turn around and we teach? Some of us now try to teach in a way that's the opposite of what we learned when we were in school. Why? Because we were not engaged. Because if the professor pontificates and gives out so much information and we ask ourselves, what am I supposed to do with that? It's the same thing in the corporate world. If you don't engage me, if you don't connect with me, and I don't understand why you're giving me this and what I'm supposed to do with it, you have failed as a leader and as a communicator. And the fact that you've given me a ton of information only makes it worse.
And we have sat through so many of those situations. By the way, before we run out of time, tell people how they can get the book. The book is called Lessons in Leadership. Now, this show is going to be running twice. We're running it fresh in July. Let's see, we're recording on the 21st. It'll be, what, the 23rd and 24th or Saturday and Sunday, I believe. And then we're going to repeat it later in August. So for some audience members, it hasn't come out yet. For some, it will be out there. Give them all the details on getting a hold of the book.
Sure. Being put out by my friends at Rutgers University Press. It'll be out in September at bookstores all across the the region and across the country. They can also go to our website at stand-deliver.com, and they can order it online right there. And listen, it's the fifth book. The others are more about communication. This is the first time I've taken on leadership and tied the two together, communication and leadership. And I want to thank the great folks at Rutgers University Press. And listen, I'm excited to see what people's reaction to the book is and how they challenge themselves to be even better, because I do believe in this concept that we never stop learning as leaders, Bob.
Let's talk about some of these great political leaders I spoke about in the beginning. Ronald Reagan called the great communicator. FDR in the fireside chats. Kennedy was so good. Nixon could be good at times. He had the emotional appeal of the Checkers speech, and then he imploded in the 1960 debate. Do you have to be a charismatic speaker to be a good leadership communicator?
You know, I've thought about this a lot, and the reason I'm going to say it's not essential is because here's what happens. As soon as you say you have to be a charismatic speaker, an orator, to be a great leader, communicator, you scare off many who don't see themselves as natural orators. And so I'm going to say this. I write about Abraham Lincoln in Lessons in Leadership, and I talk about Lincoln as a leader who had this extraordinary quality of bringing in a team of rivals, as we know. He brought in those who hated him. He brought in those, Bob, who despised him, who didn't believe in him as a leader, but he was so confident in himself, so secure in himself, another great quality as a leader, that he brought them into his cabinet, and he was a better leader because of it. Now, Lincoln as a communicator, a public orator, was terrible. He was not charismatic. He spoke in a monotone. He droned on at times, even though the Gettysburg Address, tight, short, to the point. Here's what I'm getting at. He had the ability to understand his audience, what they wanted and needed, and also challenge them. He read his audience and the emotions of the times and challenged people in a way. He was so courageous. Clearly, his record spoke for itself on slavery. It made him the quintessential leader/communicator, and he was no charismatic speaker. And so I'm going to argue Donald Trump, a much more charismatic orator, a horrific leader. But then you have those like Dr. Martin Luther King, who I write about, an extraordinary charismatic orator and a great leader. Kennedy, a very solid orator, and became or was becoming a better leader after making terrible mistakes I write about in the Bay of Pigs, learned from those mistakes, tried to ask himself where he fell down, and, as we know in the Cuban Missile Crisis, used some of those same lessons to be a better leader and was getting better when he was assassinated in November of '63.
I'm glad that we're on satellite radio so I can say the title of this chapter, How Leaders Piss People Off. How do they piss people off?
Well, first of all, I need to say, Bob Mann, where that came from. About, I think it's 14, 15 years ago, I'm interviewing the great Colin Powell, someone who is a great leader, pretty good communicator publicly. But I remember asking him, General, could you tell me the essence of leadership? Because I've been asking people this question for years and years. So he said, what? And I said, General, the essence of leadership. And he said, Steve, I don't really know what it takes to be a great leader, but I do know this. The really great leaders piss people off. He's the one who said that to me. And I said, General, and I didn't expect it. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, the truly great leaders are not the ones who are obsessed with having everyone like them all the time, being popular all the time. He said they're not afraid to make the tough decisions. They're not afraid to have the difficult conversations with the employee that's not getting it done and say, hey, listen, Bob, this is totally hypothetical. Bob, listen, on this project, I'm going to tell you where you fell short. I'm going to tell you why I'm disappointed. I'm going to tell you what the stakes are. I'm going to tell you how this is going to hurt the organization. Here's the problem. Powell said to me that too many leaders or too many people in leadership positions don't want to tell Bob Mann because it's uncomfortable how he fell short in a certain area, how what he did impacted the organization adversely. They give him the promotion because they want Bob to feel better. They never had the difficult conversation about where Bob needs to get better. Here's what he said. He said, you're better off telling Bob in a respectful way where he fell short, what the problem is, even if Bob goes home and says, I'll tell you what, the Steve Adubato really pissed me off. He said, Bob Mann is better off being pissed off at you short term because you helped him and you helped the team and you're a better leader in the process. And he said, that doesn't mean you run around trying to make people angry at you for the sake of it. He said, but if you are afraid to make the tough call and have the tough conversations because you don't want people to be peeved at you, you're no leader at all. That's where that comes from.
Since you use my name in the example of screwing up, I'm going to get defensive right now. So we'll go full circle with the entire thing.
Bob.
I know. But I heard my name in there a lot. I got to get defensive. Hey, I did my best, Steve, all right? Listen, we've got less than a minute left. Who can most benefit from this book? How should people use Lessons in Leadership?
Well, listen, when you're trying to sell books, you know the obvious answer. Anyone.
Everybody. Yeah, whether they're in Kindle or in the bookstore, they can all benefit.
Anyone who's in a leadership position in any field, anyone who sees themselves ultimately being in a leadership position, anyone who's starting a business who may have other people working for them and with them, anyone who wants to challenge themselves to be the best that they can be, anyone who wants to be a lifelong learner. I will tell you, I learned more from writing this book than any book I've ever written, more about myself and where I need to get better, and it's been a great process. And again, just talking about it with you and listening to you talk about some of the challenges you faced, and it's been one of the most exciting things for me is just getting out there, listening to people, talking to people, and I'm excited to be out on the tour in the fall, and I know I'll see you out there in the university world as well then.
Absolutely. Is it weird as a talk show host to be interviewed and be on the other side?
No, because it's pretty clear to you, Bob, I like to talk.
Right. Absolutely. Well, listen, you know, we have the option to use the hour here, and I should have said, you know what, we should have booked Steve for an hour. So we'll probably come back to you again and follow up on this. Listen, Steve, thank you very much because this is fascinating, and I hope the book does extremely well. It's my honor. And by the way, congratulations on a decade plus of terrific radio on Sirius, and just keep doing what you're doing, Bob. Thank you so very much, Steve. Steve Adubato, and the book is Lessons in Leadership.